na naš panel predavanje razgovor jedan na jedan sa Zeynep Ince. We will be now switching to English. It's my great pleasure and privilege to be able to announce Ms. Zeynep Ince, Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Phillip Morris International. Welcome.
Thank you.
And let's get a little bit acquainted with our audience. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, especially about your path, which has been a rather specific one? You basically have a legal background. You went to universities of Ankara and Nottingham. You have legal degrees, and now you're dealing with inclusion and diversity in Phillip Morris.
How did it happen?
How did it happen?
Okay, before that, I'm so sorry, unfortunately I cannot speak in Croatian, so indeed we have to have this in English. The only thing I learned is dobro jutro.
Dobro jutro.
So, good morning to everyone, thanks for being here. Thank you. So, back to the question, indeed it comes quite often, because I think people are not used to see a background other than the HR in inclusion and diversity. But I should probably start that when I was studying or when I started my professional life, there was no such path like inclusion and diversity. And I did study law because it was very close to my heart. I would say this justice and fairness are very deep values for me as a person, which also led me to study legal. And I did enjoy my work a lot. But then, when I see actually this area evolving, and my journey of IND actually started with an employee resource group. That's how we call it in PMI, where the employees are volunteering to do things around diversity. I was part of the founding committee of Women's Inspiration Network, so it was something that you do voluntarily on top of your day job. And I noticed the meetings that I was having with that committee were actually the best time of my week. I was enjoying it so much and so immensely. It started to make me think okay, actually this can be a job, and it's a very fulfilling job. And I think I was lucky because then it was offered to me. I didn't really follow, maybe I would have done this, but it came to me, so maybe the universe somehow, they feel that you want. So the company offered me if I would be interested to take over this position. And I loved it because for me, doing something I feel so passionate about and you are being paid for, it's quite a good deal, I would say. So it was a bit of coincidence, but also the passion, I would say. And also to note, I don't think you need a special background to be an inclusion and diversity kind of lead in any company. I think it's more about the passion and of course knowing how to navigate in the corporate role, which may be tackled later. But that's how I ended up there, and I'm very happy where I am.
Now correct me if I'm wrong, you insisted that actually inclusion is in the first part, inclusion and diversity, not diversity and inclusion.
Yes.
So why?
So this question also comes because it is usually either diversity inclusion or diversity equity inclusion, and I have to say I think naming protocol doesn't matter too much, obviously, it's more about the essence. But yes, we did have a special kind of purpose or a thinking behind putting inclusion in the name first, because I personally believe, and I think it's also the company position and many of you can also agree, diversity is very important. But without making the workplace inclusive, there is no meaning of having a diverse workforce. So this is why we actually believe inclusion is even more critical, not to undermine the importance of diversity, but without creating inclusion, we cannot keep the diverse profiles in the company. That's why we believe inclusion comes first, and we even use this in the naming of the department to say inclusion and diversity. But again, it doesn't mean that using a different name will bring a different meaning. It was just our kind of a symbolic way to emphasize inclusion.
If you could tell us a little bit more, what do you actually do? How does it look like to be that kind of officer and to do, to emphasizing inclusion? How does your, daily or weekly routine look like?
I actually have a few different answers because I had to explain this to my children at some point, and that answer was a bit different than what I may share with you because my friends were also like, but what it is about? It sounds nice, but what do you do? Which is a good question. I think the job actually entails defining and then driving the strategy within the company to actually really make sure that we have an inclusive and diverse workforce, because there is a very nice narrative around that. Of course everyone believes in it or everyone supports when you talk about it. But you need to do more than just talking about inclusion and diversity, and I think my job, and there are so many companies also doing this now, the job of the inclusion and diversity or DEI leads, it's more actually bringing and embedding in the policies and procedures of the company. Okay, we talk about inclusion and diversity, but how we can really make it like real. So, for example, we have many things like parental leave. I saw the video earlier today that we know, for example, caregiver responsibility is a big thing. Okay, how we can actually support our women and also men to make it more actually equal for now, what kind of actions that we can take, or we talk about representation of women. If we just talk about it's great to have women in the workplace, we can talk about it for another 10 years. But I think this role requires coming up with more concrete actually plans, targets, strategies, which company management can then actually drive to make the real change. And we can talk about a few of them, but I don't want to now hijack, I'm sure there's some questions. But it will be in a summary to actually work day to day to make this workplace better for all of our colleagues, and also to drive the policy and principle change in parallel, so actually the change will be real, not just like a nice tool for lip service.
How difficult or how challenging is it to change the still male-dominant corporate world?
Out of 10?
Out of 10.
I think it's 7 to 8, I would say. So it is really still very difficult because I am very proud of the progress that we are making as a society, not only about like my company, which gives me hope. But also we need to be, realistic. Even like the research and all the data, like World Economic Forum is actually telling us when you think about gender pay gap, which is one of the biggest pain points also discussed earlier, we need 200 more years to reach where we should be. So I don't want to be too romantic about like the changes and the progress that we are making, because the way is much longer. And it is difficult because in the end of the day, you still indeed in a male-dominated environment. And while we're trying to talk about those kind of things with people who do not belong to an underrepresented group and cannot always understand what does it feel to be underrepresented, then it's not so easy. But I do see, at least in our company and hopefully everywhere, like in the world, I see a genuine interest and commitment to make the change. Now, whether it will happen quickly, I doubt, but it's just a start, so it is still difficult.
So expectations management is also an important issue.
It is for sure.
What is the hardest wall that you have hit in your corporate life, or not only corporate life, but also your activist life or your legal life when it comes to changing the mindset?
I think again it depends like how big we think or how much we narrow. In general, if I think about like as a woman, as a mother, as an activist, I would say very personally, I'm speaking of my own capacity. This is so engraved in a way that this mindset is coming from like years and years, like 100 years. So it is very difficult to make a real change quickly. And I think the biggest wall that I'm hitting in general, not only work, is like how we will change this. Because you can influence your own circle, but you cannot really influence all the policymakers. Or there are countries that, for example, girls cannot even have access to education. This is happening in today's world. Maybe not where we are today, but that's a reality. So thinking this is actually hitting to a wall, because I want to go and then actually have all those girls living in that parts of the world, which maybe I'm not even allowed to travel. But coming back, this is like a very big picture, more like my day-to-day and corporate world. What I find difficult is we are still operating in corporate and politics as well. I think not only the corporate life, also the politics and policymakers. As you mentioned, since we still have a male-dominated group who are making the decisions, it is very difficult to actually make them understand and empathize, because we need more people who are representing the underrepresented groups in this decision-making roles, which will then actually make the real change. But it is difficult to ask someone, like, can you try to feel like being that person in that shoe? So empathy, actually, which is not so easy. So sometimes I find that it difficult because you need to be more numeric, you need to be more strategic, and I have to admit in the work, we are also talking about that it's not only the nice thing to do or it's not only the right thing to do, it is a business imperative. And unless we can convey this message in the corporate world, I don't think we will achieve much, because not everyone is equally passionate about the topic, so you really need to come with the business narrative to show this is essential for the success of your company. Then I think things are changing, but we are still having some.
This is actually something that I wanted to raise maybe a bit later, but now is the right time. We know that companies and the Western civilization is driven by profit at the end of the day. So does it help, and if it helps, how does it help to try and sell this narrative that you just mentioned? It's a big benefit for the company, for the society. We can see better numbers at the end of the day if we include more women and give them more responsibility, and there are so many benefits for us.
Yes.
So do you see that changing in mindsets of the
Very
CEOs?
Very much, yes. This is why I think, if you just rely on like how passionate that person is, then I think it's a bit of a gamble, because I don't say that, CEOs are not feeling like for equity or equality, but to be honest, most of them are more concerned about their own profit. So in the business world, I think we really need to focus on this narrative, as you mentioned, because there are facts and there are also lots of research. So even bringing those together, putting some numbers actually like on the slides to say, look, first of all, in every business, you are serving the whole demographics of the world, which includes women, like in a very predominant way. But when you think about who is making the decisions to serve, to this kind of demographic, it's not representing even your consumer base. And I think this is a no-brainer from a business perspective. But also, and for me more importantly, that we are constantly talking and again showing more like data-driven way. If you have more women in the decision-making roles, if you have more women around the table, and also not only women, I think all underrepresented groups, but women is the biggest group, obviously, then we see the productivity is increasing, we see actually there are more different opinions brought to the table, and this innovation in terms of progress of the company, this then becomes like a much more actually appealing, I would say, narrative to a CEO, because again, if you can really show that having more women in your decision-making roles will help you to grow and actually increase your business and profits, there I think they are much more into that, even if like they are not like big passionate and activists as we might be, but I think it's important to also speak that language.
One thing is profit, which I mentioned before, but the other is power. Do you believe that men in corporate world are afraid that the balance of power might be shifting if they let too many women in?
That's a very good question, and I will just share my assumption, because yes, it might be. I will share actually one example which can partially answer this question as well. For example, what we have like in PMI is this: we set some targets to increase female in the company. We first set targets for managerial positions, which we achieved, and now we are looking into more senior, like director and above roles. And while we are talking about that, I see from also our own colleagues this kind of feeling or concern that now there might be a positive discrimination towards women, or now if you are not woman, then you are not like actually, getting a promotion. So this kind of, but I would call it as losing a privilege, if I may, because to me, this is coming from the fact that you're in this position, you're in the advantageous group for years and years and years, and now, there is this kind of actually intervention mainly to bring equity and equality, and all of a sudden you feel like you are actually becoming a victim, which is not that straightforward, but I do observe that that kind of fear of losing a privilege is there. And I think it will also take some time, because you also need to convince again this peer group that they would benefit from having more women in the workplace. It's not a threat to anyone, it's just like bringing the best out of like our own collective minds. But as we discussed, it's a bit of a work in progress as well.
Expectations management, right?
Yes, exactly.
If you could like have a magical wand and change only one thing regarding how companies and societies work and operate in order to improve the position of women, to make all these things that we are talking about, what would it be?
Wow, that's a very difficult question, and if it is a real magical wand, and if I could have picked whatever I want, it may surprise you, but I would go something a bit more simple, and I would have put in the minds and hearts of people more empathy and feeling for equality, because I think this is the biggest problem we have. If we wouldn't have the greed that we have as human beings, because everyone is trying to get the power and to keep this power. If we can change that mindset, if I would have the power to do this in the whole world, not in the company, in the whole society, then I think it will solve all our problems, because then everyone will be fighting to bring equality in work instead of fighting for their own privileges. And I think this would solve all the problems at once. But I know it is way too, I don't know, difficult to get.
We will be opening floor for questions. We still have enough time, and we will be discussing our issues later. But if there's anybody at any given moment who wants to ask us something, because it's nominally one-on-one, but actually you are also invited to ask questions. So if does anybody have a question? Can I maybe see raise a hand in the air? No? Oh yes.
So one,
Yes, please.
Everyone, I would like to ask you to share with us concrete steps and procedures that you implemented within your company in order to push this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So three things that we did. Let me try to pick my top three. So one, actually I would say this representation part, because we introduced targets to increase female representation in the company, and just to unfold it quickly, we said that we would like to have at least 40% women in managerial roles globally in PMI, which we achieved last year. And I have to also recognize here, since we are in Croatia, Phillip Morris achieved 50 actually, even went beyond our international target. And now we have another one to reach 35% representation in decision-making roles, as I mentioned. And to me, this is a very important actual step, because it really, and this is by the way KPI for our senior leaders as well. So this is part of their objectives, so we take it very seriously, and we do see actually how much this changed, because we made much more quicker progress compared to before. So one would be the female representation in terms of the targets. The second one, I don't know if you're familiar, but we talked about gender pay gap, for example. I mean, you talked about, and I was trying to follow as much as I can. The second one will be equal salary certification. This is a process that we actually embarked in 2019. And there is a foundation, and there are others as well, but the one we are actually working with is a non-profit foundation in Switzerland. It's called Equal Salary Foundation, and they brought this methodology. And we are being audited. We wanted to go through this process constantly in all the markets we operate. We have more than 90 markets, and we are constantly going through an audit to actually prove also to ourselves that we do pay men and women equal for equal work. And I think this is also a big driver just for us to make sure that we are actually on the right track, because the intention is there, but it's very difficult to also see if you can really achieve this in everywhere you operate. So first is female representation targets, second is equal salary certification process, and the third one I'm trying to pick among three things that I really feel strong about. But probably, since we talk about gender equity here, we do have some tailored programs for women. It's called Women in Leadership. And this is something, it's quite an investment. It's a very deep program. It's 8 to 9 months, and this is the third year in a row that we are doing. And I always say, it's very important for me to mention this here as well. It's not something that we do to fix women. It has nothing to do with fixing women, because I think this is a completely wrong way to look into this topic. But we actually invest in our talented women to make sure actually they can reach to their the maximum potential, and also to thrive and to be happy, because it helps them to also work on their purpose, not only the company. And I think those three are the ones which are really driving a change in terms of achieving our more gender equal workforce.
While we're at it, how do you measure inclusion and diversity at Phillip Morris International?
So diversity is rather easy to start with, at least for women. I mean, we also have issues to sometimes measure the underrepresented groups where this may be invisible, and there are also so many legal obstacles around it, especially in EU. But in terms of measuring diversity, it's rather easy, because we have this data, then we can see what is the percentage of men versus women. Though inclusion is actually a very interesting topic, because for a few years, I think many companies were looking into that, including us. Okay, how we can measure inclusion, because it's a very difficult thing to materialize. And for that one, our company actually supported and launched a year-long research, and it was led by IMD Business School, also based in Lausanne. And this whole study was focusing on the concept of inclusion, how inclusion evolved also with all the societal things that we had actually, Black Lives Matter, pandemic, etc. And then it brought, after this detailed research, a methodology to measure inclusion. And now we call it Inclusion Net Promoting Score. This is like actually one question which we ask to our employees in the Pulse surveys. And then we try to link it with the underrepresentation, because it's not only about like how inclusive this workplace is. It's important to get that answer from the people who don't feel represented enough, because as we talked about the privilege, if you go and ask like the 9 men out of like 12 like management team members,
okay,
of course it's a very inclusive environment, we are so happy, so this is not like how to look into that, but we are now actually looking into that dimension, and we already have very meaningful data. And we also try to share this with other companies. So we would like to have more companies doing that, so we can actually benchmark like us with each other, and then have something a bit more concrete to measure inclusion. So this is not what we are focusing on.
For how long have you been doing that?
We started last year, because the research was actually revealed March 2022. So we started to measure this last year, and then we will continue this year and then next year, which will then give us hopefully a better like picture exactly. And also, we introduce targets now for that internally, completely, to make sure that we can actually see some progress in terms of this INPS question among people who belong to an underrepresented group. So this will give us a good idea about if we can really make the progress or not.
Do you maybe have additional questions? Thank you so much for the light.
Yes, it helps.
Did I see a hand in the air somewhere really back, or was it just my imagination? No? Well, while maybe we are waiting for some additional questions, let me ask you, what are you looking forward to? What's the next big thing in your dealing with inclusion and diversity?
I think the next thing is actually, again, more focus on inclusion for me, because the diversity, I mean, we will have people coming and joining and thriving in our workplace if we can truly make it inclusive. So, of course, I mean, we have so many things in terms of like the talent process, acquisition, management. We try to have also be completely, I mean, free of bias. We try to make the process accessible, inclusive for everyone, etc. So that's more like the having diverse workforce in. But I think the focus will be more around this inclusion piece, and also a bit back to my magical wand answer maybe, how we can bring in our colleagues who might not have directly impacted from this thing. And we actually just this month, like in March, we launched a campaign internally, it's called like All In. And we are trying to bring more of this narrative that inclusion is actually critical for everyone. And also same for gender equality. I think there's actually a t-shirt which I thought bringing today that it says that gender equality is everyone's business. I think this is so important that we continue. So for me, what is next is actually to bring men into the discussion, not just as bystanders and listening to those kind of conversations. For example, it's great and I appreciate you being there, but when you look into the room, and I know this is Women's Weekend, but we need to have more men in that discussion. We need to have more men driving this conversation together with women. And to me, this is next. We need to bring more men and more allies into these topics.
And make them realize what's going on.
Yes, exactly. And then they can also change their behaviors, because one very important thing is not to attack anyone, because I mean, it's not always coming like with intention and conscious. I mean, we know there is this concept of unconscious bias. And it's so important that everyone actually has the self-awareness and self-education, because only through that journey you notice actually one thing that you do or you say in a meeting, for example, may be very, I mean, disturbing or even offensive for a colleague, a woman who is sitting near to you. So we need to have them in this conversation for educating all of us together and for fighting for the gender equality and justice all together.
Now, given your background is you grew up in Turkey. When we talk about when we imagine these big corporations, and Phillip Morris is a big corporation, we usually look at them as a rather sterile environment. Did your background, your ethnic background, your personal experience, could you bring something new to the company regarding your personal story, regarding your personal history?
I think this might be answered better from my colleagues, but I have to say I did get this comments from some of my colleagues that I work with, which was quite actually happy to hear. And from my side, I also believe yes, because indeed, the world, like the Western world, if I may say, is a bit different than the rest of the world. So obviously, it's true that, for example, Phillip Morris is an American company, like the headquarters in Lausanne in Switzerland, so there's like the US and European representation is much higher compared to the others. And I think it helps because it's part of diversity as well. No? Like I grew up in a country, and I always say this, I think I was also among the privileged ones because I had like a very good life, a great family, very supportive. I didn't suffer much myself as actually like a woman, but I know that's not reality because I grew up in an environment where I was seeing this every day. And I have access to this information, I have access to this news, which may not be so popular like in that part of the world. So yes, knowing this and having this background does help because I think otherwise we are talking to ourselves. So it's a bit of like the same thing about empathy. Yes.
Any additional questions? Or am I being way too optimistic? Well, then I think that we can wrap this up. If you maybe have some final thought to wrap it up?
I would like to thank you, first of all, because one thing that I find very also inspiring and gives hope is actually when we get together in these kind of platforms. Again, it would be great to have more men being part of it, as we said, but it's also like big journeys starts with small steps, and I think it's very important that we, like as women and all the male allies who believe in this equality, I think we should be proud of the progress we made today, because we did make progress, without forgetting the fact that the way is long, so we should not be relaxed to say, okay, now we have 40% in this company and 50% in that company. No, it will take more time to drive this change, but I think it requires resilience as well. So my final words would probably be, believe in yourself, support each other, because there is this thing that we all need to actually connect, and then continue to fight, because the worst thing is to give up. So we always need to fight for better, and I think, maybe not in our lifetime, but I do believe that our children or our children's children will be living in a world where the gender equality and equity will not be a topic as such, so there may be other and happier occasions, to celebrate.
We'll be dealing with some other issues. Hopefully you're right. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
coming out.
Thank you.